Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, the pandemic is over.
Yeah.
Congress has solved all its problems.
Yep.
2021.
Yeah, here we are, just
Behind
plowing right ahead, surging into the new year.
Feels very the same.
Well, maybe worse. I don't know.
Maybe a little bit.
Maybe a little worse.
Yeah, just all the aggravation is really just building up into something fun. Although I'm hopeful that this Omicron thing is going to be like a 1 month problem.
Pandemic-wise, I'm actually, curiously hopeful for someone who has been on like Omicron lockdown and dealing with new school closures and the rest of it. But
The school
you
stuff,
can kind of
man.
see a light flickering there at the end of a very long, dark tunnel.
Long dark tunnel. Okay, here's what we got for you guys today, dear listeners. So we got Donald Trump endorsing Viktor Orban of Hungary, Ben's longtime friend,
Yes.
Viktor Orban. Talk about how that folds into this broader conversation we're having this week about our democracy. The latest on Russia and Ukraine. There's some news about China and Lithuania that you flagged that's very interesting. A little note about Hong Kong. There was a major election in Chile. And then we're going to talk through some of the big elections ahead of us in 2022. Finally, I got some clickbait for you about the Queen of England. The happiest interaction with the bank in history. So Ben, is Insurrection Anniversary Week, so happy
anniversary to you, Tom.
Insurrection
Yeah.
Anniversary to you. Of course, what better way for President Trump to kick off the celebrations
festivities, yeah.
than by endorsing Viktor Orban, the autocratic prime minister of Hungary, who brags about slowly strangling Hungary's democratic institutions. I think the last time we talked about Orban in depth was when Fox News's favorite white nationalist, Tucker Carlson, was over there for a week broadcasting from Budapest. Over the last decade, you've talked about this extensively. You've written about it. Orban has consolidated power in Hungary by restricting press freedom, packing courts, gerrymandering, rewriting the constitution and election laws, school textbooks. I was reading today about how he influences the culture of the government there, even appoints theater directors to ensure that, it's culturally consistent with his government. It's insane. Ben, so I sort of half joked about this being Insurrection Anniversary Week, but what do you make of this endorsement, and how do you think Trump and the right wing's embrace of Orban folds into this conversation that we're having constantly about the U.S. democracy and the threats to it?
Yeah, no, and I wanted to try to figure out a new way of attacking this because we've talked about this a bunch. And to me, I think what's so important is you have to understand, right, that Orban is a guy who has not only kind of turned this democracy into an autocracy, but he's been very clear about the fact that that's what he's doing.
And is proud of it.
Yeah, and so the reason, I start my book there, right? In 2014, he gave a speech in which he said that the future for the West is not democracy. It's something he called illiberal democracy. And he said that countries in Europe and the West generally, and that includes the United States, should look to like Russia and China as the model for the future of government and society, right? So the reason I think it really matters is this is the whole ball game here, right? Like a guy like Orban just comes out and says out loud what he is doing, which is trying to erase liberal democracy and create an ethno-nationalist autocratic model and system that Putin had already created before him. And Orban did a lot to copy Putin, that Erdogan has done in Turkey, that Netanyahu has tried with varying degrees of success to do in Israel, that Bolsonaro has tried to do in Brazil, that Duterte has tried to do in the Philippines, that Modi's trying to do in India, and on and on and on. And when you step back from the day-to-day, you have to realize that we are entering the kind of decisive question period of whether that will succeed. So Trump is the leader of the Republican Party and now just says out loud, this is who I want to align myself with. This is what we're doing.
My guy.
He's not pretending to be a small D Democrat. He's saying, no, I'm with this crowd, and the entire Republican Party's with this crowd too. Orban has an election this year. The opposition is doing everything they possibly can to be able to contest that election. We've talked about how they've all gotten behind one candidate. They've chosen the kind of most conservative small seat candidate because that guy's most likely to win. And if they can't win like that because Orban has so sufficiently rigged the system, it's hard to see that they ever will, right? In the same way here in the United States, though, the Republicans have rigged the system for themselves, right? Through gerrymandering, through eviscerating campaign finance, through packing the courts, all the same things that Orban has done in Hungary. And if they can succeed in the midterms in 2022 first, and then creating a pathway to 2024, like this is the whole ballgame, people. Like I think that the reason the endorsement matters and Trump saying it out loud matters in the context of our midterm election, Orban's election, some of these other elections we're going to talk about later in the show, is that this is really the future of whether or not Orban is right and Trump is right. That it's not about democracy or whether democracy can survive.
Yeah. And look, just so people don't think we're overstating it. I mean, Trump endorsed him. He met with Orban in the Oval Office in 2019. Orban had been denied an Oval Office meeting since 1998. Orban endorsed Trump in 2020, so this is sort of a bit of old school politics. But it's not just Trump. Steve Bannon called him a hero. Mike Pence went to a conference in Hungary last year. CPAC is doing their conference in Hungary, right? I mean, it's the whole right-wing infrastructure and ecosystem that's behind this guy. Interesting thing I read about in preparation for today. So later this year, the European Court of Justice, which is like the EU Supreme Court, is going to decide if the EU has the authority to basically condition funds that they give out to member states on, condition them saying you have to meet these core values. Do you think that will have a meaningful impact on Orban at this point, or is like the horse out of the barn here?
The horse to some extent is out of the barn, but this is a step they should have done a long time ago because they give him billions of dollars a year because Hungary is a poor member of the EU. They get billions of dollars for things like infrastructure projects. And Orban has just stolen from skimming massive amounts off the top. He gives the contracts to all of his cronies. They skim off the top and use that money, literally, to finance Orban's corruption, Orban's politics, all these things. And so this is the EU finally saying, we're going to condition this and kind of use this as a pressure tool against people like Orban. He's not the only person in the EU that they might have to consider this for. Poland next door is another country that has undergone serious democratic backsliding. But I mean, I think the point is that if we're not going to take this seriously, we're going to lose, and it's time to start to use every tool at our disposal, those of us who care about democracy, to show that this is out of bounds. But again, like, it's the same thing here, Tommy. Like, it may be too late here. The extent of gerrymandering, the extent of voter suppression laws, we're playing catch up in all these places. It's not like a starting gun went off. These people have been playing a certain game for 10 years. And you talk about the Republican Party. I mean, one of Orban's biggest lobbyists in the U.S., Connie Mack, a former Republican office holder, they've both Orban and the Republican Party trafficked in this kind of anti-George Soros conspiracy theorizing. They've got these deep tentacles that all connect. And we have to be as connected as small d Democrats, progressives, center left, all of us who care about democracy. I mean, frankly, I kind of try to think of this podcast as part of that interconnection, that we bring different voices in, and it's a forum for that because that's what they're doing.
Yeah, that is what they're doing. I mean, you hear it all the time on Bannon's show. I mean, here's the I shouldn't look for coherence in like Trump's policy views and right-wing policy views, but here's one glaring incoherent part of it, which is that the main boogeyman for the right wing, at least on foreign policy, is China. But Orban has relentlessly pursued closer ties with China. Hungary was the first European country to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Orban told Mike Pompeo to fuck off when he was trying to help them keep Huawei, a telecom company called Huawei, out of Hungary. Hungary blocked EU efforts to criticize China over Hong Kong. But do you think that Orban's like anti-immigrant kind of like right-wing religiosity just sort of glosses over all of that? Like how are they okay with both of those things?
I think that what it shows is, because you're right, I mean, Orban, the single largest Huawei production facility outside China, is in Hungary, right? They closed down George Soros's university in Hungary and are replacing it with a massive Chinese university, which is apparently also probably like a giant listening post.
Absolutely. Yes.
To spy on NATO and stuff. So it's like a security threat and economic vulnerability and all the rest of it. I think the important thing that it shows is some Republicans may sincerely hold these kind of anti-China views, right? You're kind of Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio wing of the party. But at the end of the day, it's an autocratic party committed to autocratic power on the basis of white Christian ethno-nationalism, just like Orban's party.
Yeah.
That pardon the pun, trumps everything else.
Yeah, it transcends everything.
Like everything else is secondary to the accumulation of power on behalf of their ethno-nationalist agenda. And you have to think of the Republican Party in that way, in the same way that you think about some foreign government party, that has other interests and other policies that they talk about. But what they're really only about is the accumulation and maintenance of power for their sect. And that's where we are in this country. And we're not accustomed to thinking about political parties like that. We think of them as like a collection of different factions and interests and policy positions.
Views.
Yeah. Whereas the Republican Party it's really just about one thing.
Yeah. It's far easier to unite people in that sort of like tribal, team, your team way. Okay, so dark stuff there. Let's transition to Ukraine because unfortunately tensions are still pretty high between Russia and Ukraine. There was a flurry of activity over the holidays. Biden and Vladimir Putin talked for about 50 minutes on December 30th. That must have sucked. Biden threatened sanctions. Putin threatened a major response to any sanctions, so no breakthroughs there. On Sunday, Biden called President Zelensky of Ukraine. Jen Psaki gave a readout of that call and said President Biden made clear that the United States and its allies and its partners will respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine. So again, nothing particularly new there. But Ben, there was an interesting report in Reuters about a possible way the U.S. might punish Russia if this invasion happens. It was about certain export control measures that could be part of the response along with economic sanctions. What do we know about this new, export control measure response?
Well, first of all, I mean, you mentioned this report on Reuters, and it was, you used to do this time, like
strategically.
It was clearly like they weren't concealing. It wasn't like
they wanted it out
somebody
there.
Learned.
Right.
It wasn't like we're hearing that this may be happening. It was like someone sat us down and walked us through something we're considering.
Yep.
Right. And what this is, when you talk about export controls, there are different kinds of sanctions, and some sanctions are like trying to freeze people's assets. Some sanctions are kind of trying to cut off certain companies from the financial system. And export control is like denying the capacity of a country like Russia to import certain materials, right? And what the very specific proposal in this Reuters story alluded to was denying Russia the capacity to access certain materials that are pretty essential for everything from smartphones to their defense industrial base. We're talking about semiconductors in particular and other inputs into really key Russian industries, right? So you try to cut them off through this tool from the capacity to do everything from manufacture aircraft and smartphones to other defense technologies. And so I think what they're doing here is a few different things. On the sanctions front, they're just trying to get a little more specific and saying, we're considering these types of options that are going to have a big impact potentially if they're multilateral, if other countries play ball with us on not just the Russian economy, but the Russian capacity to sustain like its military machine. Then they're also trying to shore up the rest of the alliance, particularly European allies, to go along with that, but also on the NATO front to say if Russia moves further into Ukraine, it's actually going to bring about the opposite of what they say they want, which is to get NATO out of Eastern Europe. There'll be kind of a beefing up of NATO presence in Eastern Europe. You even saw Finland, float potential NATO membership, right? So NATO expansion, which Russia obviously doesn't want either near its borders. So you're going to get, Vladimir Putin, what you don't want, right? Not just sanctions, but more NATO in your space. And, you see these allusions to the fact that if there's an invasion of Ukraine and some resistance, like we might support that in some fashion.
You flagged that in one of the stories. I mean, basically, there are suggestions not just in the reporting about the U.S. response, but about Ukraine's response, about how their military has been designed to kind of like divide into smaller parts and sort of morph into an insurgency. I mean, that's some sobering stuff. Do you think Putin has the same concerns about getting bogged down in a war in Ukraine when he doesn't have to answer to voters, really? I mean, I realize like an insurgency backed by the U.S. drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan, so there's some history here. But it does seem like their desire to take back Ukraine is a little deeper, a little more emotional than, I don't know. What do I know about Putin's motivation?
I think you're right about that. I think that at his core, right, like, and I looked at the 20 years of Putin for my book, like, not only is he a Russian nationalist, but he's a Russian nationalist who really believes Ukraine is a part of Russia, and Georgia is, to some extent a part of Russia.
It was a humiliation.
Yeah, so it's a humiliation of the Soviet Union, but it's also like Ukraine is different than certain other Soviet republics, like Kazakhstan or something, that he's not seeking to bring back into Russia. I think what this all adds up to is the Biden team trying to signal like you are about to overreach, and Putin does, Putin doesn't. One of the reasons he's concerned about this is that I remember when we were in government, the evidence was that he was covering up the loss of Russian life in Ukraine. Like he didn't want that broadcast in Russian media. There was all kind of hush-hush, right? And that shows a vulnerability. Like he doesn't want body bags coming home. He probably doesn't want enormous expenditures in a war in Ukraine. And so I think the message that the Biden team is delivering is, hey, if you do what we think you're about to do, you're about to overreach in ways that are really going to hurt you. Hey, so therefore, let's talk. And that leads to the diplomacy. And there are these meetings coming up led by Wendy Sherman on the U.S. side in a few days where I guess they'll have these conversations about, quote unquote, European security. So far, the Russian proposals are non-starters. We've talked about them, like basically NATO, leave Eastern Europe. But the question is, can you direct that to going back to the solution to the unresolved war in the parts of Eastern Ukraine where Russia's been active, which was supposed to be this kind of demilitarization of those two provinces of Ukraine and some autonomy for them that's never been fully implemented. If you can somehow steer all this energy and activity towards trying to resolve the existing conflict in Ukraine, you might forestall the other one. And look, I'm on this one, the Biden people are they're trying to play the best hand they've got, and because at the end of the day, you can't control Vladimir Putin.
No, you sure can't. This export control thing is interesting. It's a little unnerving to me. In that Reuters story, there's a mention about how we did sort of a similar action during the Trump administration by denying a chip or something to China that went into Huawei phones. It just made me think, what if the Chinese said, okay, Apple, you can't manufacture phones in China anymore? I mean, it seems like we'd be slightly fucked. The two could play at this game in a way that could be really scary.
Yeah, no, and Apple, will no longer be a $3 trillion company. I mean, because Apple doesn't just sell phones in China, like you said, they manufacture.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to diversify out of it, but I imagine that Foxconn is still doing a lot of work in China.
I bet. I mean, you're right, and what it makes it's another proof point that we could be heading towards a kind of complete severing of whatever supply chain feeds China, Russia, and their autocratic partners in the supply chain the rest of us depend on. And I don't know, the faster that happens, the more disruptive it'll be economically.
Yeah, big time. Sticking with China for a second. So, Ben, you flagged this very odd story. So Lithuania evacuated all of its diplomats from China because they were concerned that the Chinese wouldn't recognize their immunity from prosecution. NPR had a big piece on this. They described the evacuation as so sudden that some diplomats had to leave their pets behind, which I'd just like to note is monstrous. Yeah, it's horrible. So the background here, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations from the 60s, I think, codified this concept of diplomatic immunity, which says if you're a diplomat, you're serving abroad, you can be expelled from that country, but you can't be susceptible to a lawsuit or prosecution. That immunity can be waived if, the U.S. ambassador to Canada murders someone in Toronto, right? You'll probably get prosecuted. You'll probably wind up in a Canadian jail. But they're trying to protect them from, intimidation and let diplomats do their jobs. So the Chinese government demanded that Lithuania's diplomats give back their diplomatic credentials after Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open an office in the Lithuanian capital. As we've discussed before, China thinks that Taiwan is their territory, and they wildly overreact when anyone suggests otherwise, which in this case also included blocking Lithuanian exports, recalling their ambassador to Lithuania, and just generally downgrading diplomatic relations. So, Ben, I'm not surprised that China would bully the shit out of a country of 3 million people like this, but it did seem... I don't know. Do you think they thought through the prospect of potentially unraveling one of the foundational principles of diplomacy? They don't want us arresting a bunch of Chinese diplomats in Washington.
This is why I kind of flagged this. I read this story, and I kind of did a double take. I was like, what? They basically shut down an embassy, and it didn't get that much attention. But there's two things that jumped out to me. One is that Lithuania's got some can we say
some stones?
They got some, they got some stones. I mean, because they've also been the safe haven for the Belarus opposition, and they've had these interactions with Taiwan, and they're clearly a country that is run out of fucks to give.
Where do you think that comes from? 3 million people.
I think it comes from being a former Soviet republic,
Yeah.
and so their identity and their connection to the idea of freedom, to use a word that has gone out of favor, is really intense, and they're willing to take some hits for it. But man, this is because like we use these Cold War paradigms, like. In the Cold War, we had embassies in places.
Right.
I mean, that's why this stood out to me. Is like this is kind of more extreme.
This goes back to like the 1700s when you would arrest like the king's cousin before you got into war.
So to me, it's this kind of weird bellwether of like, where is this all headed? Like, we're not even gonna have like embassies. I mean, it just shows you how intense the Chinese pressure is, and if you decide to take a stand. Like Lithuania did, you may just need to leave the pets behind.
Don't bring your dog to the Beijing embassy.
Well, and if you look at it, remember the Chinese arrested the Chinese Communist Party. I always need to differentiate. Arrested like a couple Canadians when the Huawei official was arrested in Canada. I mean, like we're entering into like waters that even in the Cold War.
That's basically kidnapping, right? I mean, that's reciprocal prosecution and detention.
And so this is, I just, like, underneath the surface of what's happening in the world, there's, like, some pretty extreme sorting out happening in terms of, like, the China bloc and China-Russia bloc and the rest of the world.
I should have said hostage taking, not kidnapping, but you get the concept.
Yes.
Another just quick update that I noticed over the break, Ben. So it's worth flagging for listeners that press freedom is dying, if not all but dead, in Hong Kong. Most recently, a crowd-funded site in Hong Kong called Citizen News announced that they're shutting down after Hong Kong police raided the headquarters of another outlet called Stand News, arrested 6 staff and board members. So, we talked back in the day about the crackdown on Apple Daily, another major formerly independent news outlet in Hong Kong. This is another series of arrests, another series of intimidations and threats that are just shutting down the free press. So it's just very sad.
Yeah, I mean, there's what's so striking about it too. Again, like it's in keeping with the theme here, but like just a couple of years ago, there was like a very vibrant free press in Hong Kong. You go there, and there's a lot of different newspapers and magazines and different options. There's a growing Chinese Communist Party line, but here we are. Fast forward just a couple of years, and they basically eradicated the free press entirely. Never mind the fact that they're also seating now the quote unquote patriots only legislative body there after having a quote unquote patriots only election. And I don't have to go into deep analysis to inform you who kind of makes it in
counts
the Patriots Assembly. You and I would not be patriots in that thing. So Hong Kong, I mean, the transformation is just extraordinary in just a couple of years.
Yeah, Carrie Lam was asked about this press freedom stuff, and she just did a whataboutism clapback bullshit thing. I mean, it's over.
She's kind of the Vichy, government official
Totally.
there. It's these people. It's sad because Hong Kong has been this kind of vibrant center of culture, and now they're just going to try to turn into another Chinese city.
Yeah. Here's some exciting news out of Chile. So Gabriel Boric, he's a 35-year-old leftist candidate, handily defeated his right-wing opponent named Jose Antonio Cast and will become Chile's youngest modern president. Cast, the conservative here, spent the election arguing that Boric was a communist stooge, but in a nice show of unity, he immediately conceded on election night when he realized he lost, and he actually personally traveled over to Boric's campaign headquarters to have a meeting that night and show unity. So that must be nice.
Yeah,
remember when that used to happen here. Boric rose to prominence over the last few years during protests over economic inequality. Actually, I remember talking about this in 2019. It was initially over the Santiago metro fare went up, sparked a protest.
This podcast has been long enough that
we've been
the
around
students
for a while.
in the streets are now running the country.
Literally. So, this guy is, he's young, he's from the left, he represents a firm break from Chile's past as a dictatorship. He has pledged to tackle climate change. He wants to turn Chile into a basically European-style social democracy, which will be challenging with a divided Congress, but, it's a good agenda. Turnout was high. 56% of the country voted in the runoff. I don't know, Ben, your thoughts on Boric, this election, what it says?
Well, I mean, a few things. First of all, he won by a lot. He won by 11%, just crushed, right? So this was a decisive win. And it does speak to the kind of culmination of a years-long effort on the left in Chile, right? He pronounced that, Chile was the birthplace of neoliberalism, right? With Pinochet and a bunch of right-wing economists from New York, Chicago.
Neoliberalism could mean so many different things depending on who you're talking to. It
Exactly.
could mean Pinochet. It could mean us. It could mean Obama. I never know what a neoliberal
Well,
is.
he said it's going to be the death of neoliberalism in Chile, right?
Great.
So that's his agenda.
I don't like that version.
But I mean, it's the bad version. It's definitely the worst version.
Pinochet throwing people out of helicopters. Great.
But, but economics that lead to inequality, right? And so
Yeah.
he really wants to tackle inequality.
Which is great.
Significant raises in taxation and dramatic increases in social services. He's going to have to navigate both the fact that they're rewriting Chile's constitution at the same time that he's beginning to govern.
And he might have to run again, depending on how that process goes.
Depending on that process, right? But if he succeeds and he can kind of run this gauntlet, and I will say he's moderated a bit, over the course of the election from being like at the far end of the left to trying to bring in other people into his coalition, which is good. I mean, a sign of somebody who wants to get things done. I'm not just saying that because it's not the neo-lib here saying like
no. The reason I was smiling is because he's young enough to like be pretty online, and I think it came out that he's like a big Taylor Swift fan, and like there was like impressions he was doing. Maybe it was very, very funny.
I mean, I'm for T Swift.
She's great. Yeah.
I think that the other thing that we've talked about a bit on this podcast though is that like while we don't focus that much on Latin American politics in the United States, like it is moving so fast to the left.
Well, that's what I want to ask you.
Yeah.
Because people always talk about, they say Chile, a lot of the coverage is like, oh, Chile is the bellwether in Latin America. They moved first, right? They were the first to break from the U.S. during the Cold War. They elected a socialist. That ended with a coup and the Pinochet dictatorship, and the U.S. had a horrible role in propping them up. That's a conversation for another day.
One of Henry Kissinger's finest hours.
Yeah, really great work there, everybody. But I mean, do you agree with that take? Like, do you think there's evidence to suggest that we are seeing this broader liberal progressive wave in Latin America?
100%. I mean, and if you just think about the Argentina moved to the left in their elections. Honduras, we recently talked about moving to the left, right? Now Chile moving to the left. You've got Lula out of prison, poised to take back power in Brazil and move it to the left. Colombia has had a right-wing president increasing protests against things like inequality. They have an election coming up, right? Every election, like there's in Bolivia, right, where Evo Morales' party came back. Every election is sending a message that people in Latin America are absolutely fed up with the extreme inequality there. There's a strong environmental component to these movements. There's been strong movements for abortion rights. Mexico, governed by a left-wing populist, right? And at the same time, like, what did I see in the news about America's Latin America policy yesterday? The Biden administration is sanctioning Airbnb over its activities in Cuba.
What is going on
which is
there?
like Americans visiting Cubans, staying in their homes, paying Cubans directly. So
why would they do that?
I'm not here to get on my Cuba hobby because they're just it's Marco Rubio's policy, right? And I'm not on my Cuba hobby horse. What I'm saying is that what is our policy? I think this is great. I think there's a lot of health in these countries dealing with inequality. Where's the United States in this conversation? We're still playing the kind of ugly neighbor to the north, obsessed with Cuba, and Venezuela, and just totally not meeting this moment. We should be working together with these countries to borrow the Biden administration's phrase, build back better. There
you go.
And so to me, there's a real risk that the U.S. is hosting this Summit of the Americas, right, which happens every 3 years. This year in 2022, like that we're just going to show up like totally out of step with the zeitgeist down there.
Yeah, I saw you tweeting about the Cuba steps. Very frustrating.
Yeah,
quite
it's
disappointing.
Just kind of self-defeating. Yeah.
So you kind of previewed this. I mean, we're all fixated on the U.S. midterms in 2022, but there's some big international elections to watch this year. So I will list a few, probably too many, and then let's just like pluck out and talk about whatever you want. So Mali is scheduled to have an election in late February. They just went through 2 coups in like 9 months. So that, I think the question is really whether that election will happen or happen in a way that's fair. South Korea votes on March 9th. We'll see who replaces President Moon Jae-in, close U.S. ally. North Korea approach will be dictated by that leader, so it's important. The French vote on April 10th, although they'll probably have a runoff, so it'll go later. But you got President Macron, who's like this, intense centrist. We'll have to deal with two
intense centrist is a very good
violently centrist. He'll have
neo-lib, definitely a neo-lib.
Very neo-lib. So he'll have two right-wing opponents now. He has
yeah.
Marine Le Pen and this newcomer, who we should do a whole segment on him at some point. This guy, Eric Zemmour, who's basically like French white supremacist. Like, it's basically like Tucker Carlson running for president, but he's like gaining a lot of support. Hungary goes to the polls in April or May. We talked about Viktor Orban already. Australia has parliamentary elections sometime before May 21st. It would be great to get Scott Morrison the fuck out of there, get some Labour candidates in.
Somebody won't shit the McDonald's,
Yeah, Philippines on May 9th. We figure out who succeeds Duterte. Colombia on the 29th of May. Kenya picks a successor to President Kenyatta on August 9th. It's a big deal. Brazil, as you mentioned, votes on October 2nd. Hopefully they get rid of Bolsonaro. Lula could come in. Bosnia, October 2nd, Tunisia, December 17th. That's okay. That's officially too much listing.
Yeah.
I was listening to my boy Steve Bannon's show today. He and his crew.
What's he watching?
They're very focused on Hungary,
Oh.
France, Brazil, right? The axis of assholes, Trump, Orban, Bolsonaro. Which ones do you want to talk about? Which are the biggies you want to flag?
Well, actually, I'm glad you hit up your boy Bannon here, because I think you can bucket a couple of these, right? So one is they're the elections to watch for this kind of trend that we started with, right?
Authoritarianism, yeah.
And to me, Bannon usefully
shocking
assignment editor for this, because France, basically can the center hold there with Macron, or somehow some center left candidate gets in, but basically. The outcome you want there is just that you don't want the far right to win. That would be very, very bad, right? Hungary, we have obviously talked about this kind of huge opportunity to try to dislodge Orban. Brazil, essential that Bolsonaro not win. I mean,
huge.
Who we should add is got his 29th case of COVID, and
he's back in the hospital.
Intestinal surgery.
Well, I think that's because he got stabbed, right?
Yeah, so that's
he has intestinal blockages.
But so to me, those elections, right? France, Hungary, Brazil. The Philippines feels pretty greased for it to be not Duterte dynasty, but Duterte's daughter is vice president to Marcos's kid, and that doesn't seem good, right?
Not good.
Yeah. So those are the elections to watch for this kind of autocracy question, right? Then you look at Kenya is interesting, and actually I'm going to make a correction here. I made a mistake. I was listening to the earlier pod, and I had the wrong tribal. I was listing the kind of key tribal backgrounds of the election candidates that have led to violence in the past, and I missed the name of Obama's family's tribe. That's not the one you want to mess up, which is the Luo.
Oh, is Luo, that Odinga's?
Yeah, that's Odinga, Raila Odinga, who's run the Luo and the Kikuyu are the two tribes.
Yeah.
But the thing to watch in Kenya is basically whether or not there's a reprise of the ethnic violence we've seen in the past between the two big.
And Odinga is going to run again, it sounds like.
He runs every time,
Right,
and he always kind of gets real close, and it's close enough to be contested, and he may have frankly won in the past too. But Kenya you want to watch because you just don't want some further ethnic violence. So that's it's such an important African country that deserves more attention. So you watch that one for that reason,
and probably Bosnia Herzegovina for similar reasons.
Similar reasons, right? And so those ones you want to watch for just are there going to be tensions? Mali too. Mali, the question I have in Mali is it's one of these countries where there's all this instability, and we've talked about this in Haiti context, and the international community, such as there is one, the answer is always to hold an election as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, is that the right approach? Because is that going to lead to more violence?
Right,
too,
and
right?
then just drone strike the shit out of the northern part of Mali.
Yeah. So to me, those are the things to watch in all these elections. Oh, and then lastly, Colombia, in line with the conversation we've been having. If Colombia moves to the left, right, because that's traditionally been a more right-wing country in Latin American politics, that signals that the whole region is going to be literally governed by center-left to left-wing candidates. I mean, maybe not the entirety of it, but it's hard for me to think of a big country that wouldn't be if Colombia and Brazil go that way.
Yeah, the other big one worth noting that I didn't include is that Uttar Pradesh was the biggest state in India. Imagine a state with nearly 250 million people are going to vote. They vote to elect a new legislative assembly in March 2022. That has big implications for Prime Minister Modi and the BJP Hindu nationalist government. By the way, did you see that these psychopaths in India are putting these
yeah.
female Muslim journalists on some website where they say they're being auctioned.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just really horrific, ugly stuff.
I saw Rana Ayub, friend of the pod,
Yeah.
tweeting about this. So,
Yeah.
you know, if you don't follow her on Twitter or subscribe
Follow
to her
Rana.
Substack,
Yeah, definitely.
support her.
Yeah, you know what? Check out her Substack. It's really good.
It's really good.
It's really good reporting.
There's also some speculation that Turkey could call early elections in 2022, but who knows?
Well, as we talked about, Erdogan's like his experimenting with inflation is if Joe Manchin was in the Turkish legislature, he'd be having a conniption fit, man. Yeah.
You would be having a hard time for a lot of reasons. All right, so that's a really motley selection of
But I think
elections to watch.
the key takeaway is that on this question of autocracy, democracy, there's a bunch of bellwether elections this year, more than usual. You know.
Yeah. One other thing before we get sort of the lighter stuff at the end. So I saw that Haiti's Prime Minister Ariel Henry survived an assassination attempt Saturday as he was attending an event at a church, by the way, marking the anniversary of Haiti's independence. As we've discussed before, the Jovenel Moïse, the former president of Haiti, was assassinated last July. Henry's office said bandits and terrorists were behind the coup attempt, or the assassination attempt, rather. Who knows? One person was killed, 2 were injured. So horrible.
Yeah, no, I mean, it just shows the complete lack of security, and it also raises the question of like, who's exactly raising their hand to run for office in Haiti?
Oh my God, yeah.
I mean, just
someone who has some built-in protection, right?
Yeah.
Like a gang.
That's right. That's right.
Not good. Okay, a few quick things before we get to the interview. So Ben, there were some sort of clickbaity headlines over the New Year about the bizarre quote-unquote game the Queen of England likes to play on New Year's Eve. I don't know if you saw these. I was hoping you could put on your royal hat to confirm or deny them. So the game is reportedly called Lucky Dip. A footman, I love that term, brings Her Majesty to like a tub full of sawdust and some folded pieces of paper. I'm not sure why you need the sawdust. The paper they have messages on them and predictions for the year ahead. Everyone, I assume like Philip and like whatever, all the queen's friends, picks out a piece of paper.
Well, Philip's dead. But
yeah,
I'm sure he was good at it back in the day.
Harry, whatever. They pick out a piece of paper, and I guess if the particular forecast is not very favorable, the poor footman gets the blame. This is in some book. Here's my problem with this anecdote in this game.
What do they do to the footman?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Beat him up. It just sounds really boring.
They
It's
put him
like
in the Tower of London or something?
It's like Magic 8-Ball with sawdust. Like
Yeah.
I would think that Her Majesty is having a little more
You
fun
just
than that.
Order some Chinese and have some fortune cookies, you know?
That's what this sounds like.
Yeah, you could just update the game a little bit.
I don't know. I didn't like this.
I didn't like. It doesn't sound very fun to me. It sounds like it was probably the first time they did it. They were probably drunk. You know, it was like, hey, I got an idea. Let's fill a tub with some sawdust and have the footman put a bunch of
back in
predictions
1964
or
something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like a lot of things in the royal family. It just needs some updating.
Yes.
You know, like it was probably cool at the beginning.
Yeah, you just play heads up instead or something.
Back when Prince Margaret was like a man eater, you know, and now it just needs,
George Harrison was the first one.
Yeah, exactly. It needs to get into the 21st century.
Have you watched that Beatles doc, by the way?
Oh, just fucking crushed it.
I watched the first
tore through it.
2 episodes, which is like 4 hours of programming. I have not finished it yet.
I finished it in like a week.
It's really good.
It was just like engaging with like creative genius for 8 hours.
Yeah, you just watch them kind of like bring these songs into being. Final story is also from the UK. So a British bank called Santander said that about 2,000 customers mistakenly received double payments on Christmas Day. So it means they paid out a total of $175 million accidentally to like their clients.
What a great.
The bank said this was great Christmas. It was due to a technical issue. Some payments from our corporate clients were incorrectly duplicated. Blah blah blah. None of our clients were at any point left out of pocket as a result, and we will be working hard with many banks across the UK to recover the duplicated transactions over the coming days. So I read this and I was like, it's kind of interesting. I'm sure they'll like get it all back. But then this CNN story I was reading mentioned that there was a similar incident by Citibank. Citibank meant to send $8 million to lenders to Revlon, the cosmetics company. They accidentally wired out closer to $900 million to these lenders. And here's the best part. Some of them just said, no, we're not returning it. It was just like essentially a repayment of a loan too early. They were just like, fuck it, no. Yeah. We're not going to give you your money back. And I just thought that was incredible. They've been in court for years now trying to get like $500 million of this bank's money back. Can you imagine being the guy?
If a bunch of money showed up in my bank account and then someone came to me a few weeks later and was like, "Hey, can I get that back?" I'd be like,
Yeah, make me.
"Yeah, come on." And no, you gave it to me.
Yeah, like I will never forget standing
It's all
outside.
just numbers on a computer screen, right?
Yeah, it's all,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
right. Just a little fraud here and there.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, like, it must have been 2007. I was standing. I have this like image in my mind because it's a freezing cold day. I was at the Iowa office in Des Moines, and I was in the
Happy
parking
anniversary,
lot.
by the way.
Oh, thank you. It was the Iowa
Anniversary
anniversary
of the
last
Iowa
night.
caucus. Yeah,
That's a good one. 14th. You don't really celebrate that.
Not a big one. Is
Tweet-
that paper or
Yeah, it's democracy. Let's keep it. So I remember like calling Bank of America because they had let me buy like 7 coffees and then charged increasing fees on top, like overdraft fees, like $25, $35. And I was just like, all of a sudden I'm down like $300, and I didn't have a savings account to like cover the overdraft, and they just
Yeah.
fucked me, and I never got that
really.
back.
That's like my biggest fear because I don't watch this stuff nearly as closely as I should, and I'm prone to like the reverse, bank thing where they just. I mean, what if the bank did to you what they did in Office Space? Remember in Office Space at the end, where they're just like stealing little bits of money?
Yeah.
Or they're trying
The
to,
worm.
and then they end up, like they could do that to me. I mean, what would suck here is if you got the money on Christmas, and then they just like you think it's like this kind of nice.
Yeah, what if you
Christmas gift
spent it?
from yeah, and then they just take it back. I don't know. That's not cool.
And it feels wrong.
It feels like this bank could afford to take the hit and let people keep the money.
Yeah, let them keep the money.
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna learn that
Maybe
they're
the
like
Chilean guy would make sure that the neolibs didn't take the money back.
Yeah.
You know?
Meanwhile, Bukele, the other millennial
Yeah.
in Latin America, would buy the dip.
Well,
with that
because
money.
as Matt Damon reminds us, the future belongs to the brave.
To the
like
brave
Bukele,
Oh, that commercial. I love that commercial. I've got a website open in front of me that's an archive from GW about the CIA's covert activities following the 73 military coup in Chile, and it is extensive.
I mean, I would encourage people if you haven't, if in your like lefty college days you didn't go down the rabbit hole of the CIA's coup of Salvador Allende. It's a pretty gross story.
I would like to know what united those, what convinced those people that they were the good guy. You know what I mean? At what point are you like working with death squads to the point where you realize like, oh, I'm not the good guy? Was it just anti-communist fervor? Was it like right-wingness? Was it fear that, I don't know, some sort of like post-World War II hangover that, where you just feared the greatest evil possible in the world? I don't know.
I mean, I think, right, like in that case, the communism was the pretext, right? So Salvador Allende gets elected, democratically elected president of Chile. He's a communist. Then there's this, and I got into this because of my Cuba, there's this kind of like weird outsized fear of Cuba, which I think, here's my theory of this, is that the CIA, and by extension the kind of U.S. national security establishment that like people like Kissinger were at the center of, never got over the fact that they couldn't beat the Cubans.
They got punked.
They got punked, right? They quote unquote lost Cuba. Then they couldn't assassinate Castro. The Bay of Pigs failed, and they just like stuck in their craw. And if you look at the U.S., like we don't like these countries that we lose our quote unquote grip over, right? Like Iran, Cuba, are the ones that we had the longest term problems with, right?
And there's the overlapping corporate interests, like the Banana Republic.
Well,
stuff,
that's right. That stuff was huge down there, right? But they basically they assassinate, they shoot the guy, kill the guy in the presidential palace. I mean, it was an unsettled coup, and then Pinochet goes in, and then it turns into the great oppressive neoliberal experiment, right?
Brutal. Tough reading. Worth it though.
But here we are, and we've got like a 36-year-old lefty in charge of Chile. So,
Yeah, man.
History can change.
It can.
Yeah.
What was it? What did that guy we used to work for say? Arc of the moral universe is long.
Yeah.
Bends towards justice.
Sometimes it does. Yeah.
Takes some effort.
Yeah, it takes a little effort to
It's not
bend
really
that arc.
bending at the moment.
Yeah, it's just kind of drifting
It's
up in
kinda
the wrong
floating
direction,
off.
right? We're just gonna reach up and grab it.
Floating off to
We
Mars
need a bunch
or
of
something.
worldos to get their hands on that arc.
Yeah, hurry up,
Yeah.
everybody, or else Steve Bannon's going to do it for us in the
Yeah.
wrong direction. Okay, talk to you guys next week.
See ya.